So amidst the landscape where a lot of AAA publishers and their executives seem to lean towards the worst trends and habits possible, where it's making the games industry kind of unsustainable in the way they're approaching game development and the way they're just ballooning to a point where there's just no way this can continue in a way that can maintain itself for the long term. It's good to see some developers speak out with just some sense and some perspective and some long-term outlook on how the games industry should navigate itself to just be better, not only in its ability to be sustainable, but also just to make better products that come from the right place and in turn sort of advance what the medium is capable of. So I want to present three major developers who spoke up about the current state of the games industry, starting with Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 developer, or more specifically, Saber Chief Creative Officer Tim Willits. Saber being the developer behind Warhammer 40k Space Marines 2, which was this, I keep saying Space Marines, it's just singular Space Marine, but either way, this was a highly successful single-player, almost like old-school style game that was like a 10 to 12-hour-long campaign with some multiplayer features that weren't monetized to hell. It was almost like what at this stage of history can be considered a classic style video game, but one that was done with modern sensibilities. And it went on to do really, really well. It didn't sell GTA 5 numbers or whatever, but it sold a couple million, and it made its money back because it had a reasonable budget. It wasn't bloated in its goals, and it was just a simple video game with a very specific goal that did a couple of things really well and really just kind of established the Warhammer identity and ran with it without trying to think about engagement or whatever. They just thought about what's the most fun Warhammer game we can make here, and they did. And so this right here was in response to Tim Sweeney having said that there's just been this generational change that has led to some games failing to sell as well as the publishers had hoped for. He said one of the manifestations of that change we're seeing right now is that a lot of games are released with high budgets and they're not selling nearly as well as expected, whereas other games are going incredibly strong. What we're seeing is a real trend where players are gravitating towards the really big games where they can play with more of their friends. This feels like a low-key dig at single-player games where he's saying that people want to play with others, but that's not necessarily the case. I mean, yes, Space Marine 2 does have multiplayer components, but it's not its primary way of playing. It is, at its core, a single-player experience with multiplayer components. I played it completely single-player and had a great time, and a lot of people did as well. And so speaking to IGN, Willits, the developer from Saber, said that the problem isn't necessarily that AAA games are too long or take too long to develop and thus launch into already abandoned genres. Rather, AAA developers are tending to overscope their games, which in turn means they fail to do any one thing brilliantly. They spread themselves too thin. They want to be a jack of all trades instead of a master of one or a couple things. He specifically said, here's the exact quote, "It is not necessarily the genre that has moved on because great games will always do well. One of the things that we try to do at Saber, and this is part of my job as creative officer of all teams, we have a core belief that what you do every second and what happens when you push these buttons and that core gameplay loop is so critical. So we focus on the moment-to-moment interaction, the gameplay, and the feeling you have." And that's the thing about Space Marine 2. And I know this is a memeable quote, but you really do feel like a Space Marine. Like what that power fantasy feels like, they capture that so well. And they didn't go crazy with like skill trees and whatever. Like the gameplay overall is simple, the progression is simple, but they made a campaign just the right amount of length to justify that simplicity, and within that simplicity was a complex feeling of like, this is what it's like to have that power fantasy of donning this armor and being a part of this group, you know, and you know, fighting for the Emperor and whatnot. And I mean, there are those missions when you put on that freaking jetpack and suddenly your whole world opens up and you feel that much more powerful, but you're still vulnerable enough where the game does present a challenge. But if you get those gameplay mechanics and you execute on them correctly, you are just on it. You know, you're locked in and you're slaying monsters and Tyranids left and right. And it's just a great feeling. He continues, and then we adhere to our core pillars, like be the ultimate Space Marine, melee, range, swarms. That's it. You know, that, like they just had this very specific thing they wanted to achieve, this very specific feeling they wanted to evoke. The game is called Space Marine, so it's all about being a Space Marine. And they didn't focus on how do we make Space Marine engaging or monetizable. They just said, what is the most fun thing we can do with players inhabiting the shoes of a Space Marine? And that's what made this game, do so well. It's what spread word of mouth. It's what garnered it great critical reception. They took those specific things and just really focused on it and executed on it really, really well. And a lot of teams throughout development will overscope games, says Willits here. They look at some other game that just came out and say, oh, we got to do that, and let's add this, we got to do this, and they lose focus on the core, what actually makes the game fun. Thank you. We're not in Space Marine 2 doing things that, well, the swarms are new technology, but there isn't some revolutionary new gameplay mechanic that no one's ever seen before. There are gameplay mechanics that people are familiar with, but we do it really, really well, and we execute really, really well, and they do it with their own unique flavor that comes from the love of Warhammer and the specific feeling they're trying to achieve with Space Marine. There's just a focus and like a very specific intention with this game. And they didn't have to break the bank to make a game like this because they kept their scope within a reasonable range. So, for example, the budget for Space Marine 2 was half that of Doom Eternal, the last game that Willits worked on while boss of id Software before leaving to join Saber in 2019, which is kind of crazy to me because Warhammer feels weirdly like an expensive game, but then you look at its length and the fact that it does ultimately have a reasonable scope, and I guess it makes sense that it's not even as expensive as Doom Eternal, only half of Doom Eternal. I didn't expect that. But yeah, and so it sold a couple millions, but it didn't have to sell a bajillion for it to break even. It just had to do decent, and it did more than decent. It actually did really well. And so it made the profit margins were substantial. Willits said right here, we don't need to sell 4 million units to make it a success. There are many games, sadly, especially out of North American developers, where if you do not sell 5 million copies, you are a failure. I mean, what business are we in where you fail if you sell less than 5 million? He continued, there are examples like that, and we do not want to be that business. We want to be a developer that focuses on the core experience, what makes the games actually fun, and then do it really well, and then make it affordably. You look at Square Enix and their expectations on, how many units they have to sell for stuff like Final Fantasy VII, the remake entries to be successful or to be deemed financially successful. Final Fantasy 16, that is just overscoping right there. You look at recent Ubisoft games, aside from the fact that sales have kind of started to diminish, the games that they make are so bloated and just so kind of out of control in scope and the budget, that the number of units they have to sell to kind of make it not a disappointment has become less and less tenable. Now, you do have projects like Baldur's Gate 3, which were significant in their budget. That was not like a Space Marine 2 kind of budget. Baldur's Gate 3 was a AAA development project, but it had the D&D name behind it, and it had the benefit of a creative team that genuinely set out to make the most fun RPG possible. They weren't focused on what do we do to make it the most, engaging for monetization. Again, all those bad habits that AAA companies tend to lean on. They really made something so just full of substance and heart. They made something with such pure intent and focus. They really set out to create the ultimate Dungeons and Dragons video game experience, and they executed on it so well that the praise that it garnered just spread like wildfire, and the game's numbers just continued to balloon, not only during early access, but also after launch. And the fact that the early access, they took feedback from players and used that to better the game. It's the process of that. While this was a risky venture because of how much money they put into this, they actually did it right. Next developer I want to highlight who spoke out about the current state of the games industry is Metaphor Refantazio's director, Katsura Hashino. For those who don't know, this is basically fantasy Persona, but even that seems reductive. It really does take the formula that Persona established and really takes it to the next level. And this game has garnered all kinds of praise. A lot of people are saying it's Game of the Year contender. I just started playing it myself, and already I'm having a blast. I love the setting, the presentation, the music, the battle systems, and the evolution of the JRPG mechanics that we're seeing here. While talking about Persona and the inspiration behind making those games, he talked about how these characters, and same with Metaphor characters, they're facing anxiety and all these other big things that affect everybody that are relatable no matter who they are, where they are, or how old they are. And then he added, I feel like if you have these super highly polished games that look like they were designed by a bunch of people in a CEO boardroom, that doesn't really excite me. It doesn't really interest me. And one of the unique things about Persona is its aesthetic. It's a style that is so quintessential to Atlus, and it's one of those things you cannot replicate by having CEOs in a boardroom say what they think a game should look like. This comes from like an artist's point of view. They have something to say with not just the storytelling, but also the visuals, which in themselves are their own form of storytelling. And the fact that they managed to output a game like Metaphor and it sold really well. I mean, it might actually be the fastest selling Atlus game. It sold 1 million units in a day. That's more than Persona games have done in the past. And so you can see Atlus sticking to their guns, sticking to their identity, sticking to what they do well, evolving on that formula, and slowly but surely the traction that their new releases gain continues to grow. And we're seeing them really just kind of flourish as a developer who know who they are and the kinds of games they like to make and what kinds of games they're really masters at, while still not being stale, while still evolving the formula and trying new things like a whole new fantasy genre style game that is very different from Persona in a lot of ways. And they kept their budget reasonable. They didn't go insane with the scope of the game, even though it is like a 100+ hour game. They still managed to make it in like a decently timely manner. And they managed to make it in such a way where selling a couple million units can be deemed a financial success, unlike, say, again, like Square Enix, where a couple million units is just not enough for them anymore to make money. So that's all the right ideas, but the whole notion of like, you can't make something exciting with CEOs looking at market research and all these things. Art comes really from the heart. Fun is something you have to feel. It's not something you can calculate. You know what I mean? It's just something you have to have an exciting idea for, and then execute on as an artist, not as a fucking glorified accountant. And then we have finally Shawn Layden, former PlayStation CEO, former PlayStation boss, who kind of talked about the way the AA genre of games is starting to disappear and how that's kind of a threat to gaming, to the games industry, and why that is detrimental to the future, as transcribed here by gamesindustry.biz. This is a conversation that Shawn Layden had with Raw Fury co-founder and chief publishing officer Gordon Van Dyke. He had this to say: in the past, we spent a lot more time looking at games and not asking, what's your monetization scheme, or what's your recurrent revenue plan, or what's your subscription formula? All these are now part of like pitches for major AAA publishers that just weren't once upon a time. Before, we asked the simple question, is it fun? Are we having a good time? If you said yes to those questions, you'd usually get a green light. You didn't worry so much about the end piece, for better or for worse. Of course, back then you didn't make a game for millions of dollars, so your risk tolerance was fairly high, but publishers were also more tolerant to those kinds of games that weren't ridiculous in their budget, but now everything has to be super high budget to keep up with certain trends and the like. And it's like, we gotta like chill the fuck out as a games industry. That's why like when I released my review of Warhammer 40K Space Marine 2, the title of that video for me was, we need more games like this. Not everything has to be immense scope stuff. Those kinds of stuff can exist, but it can't be the norm. Not everyone can be Take-Two spending whatever the budget for GTA 6 will end up being, and spending that kind of money on games. And not everyone can be a Larian Studios and can afford to make a game of the scope of Baldur's Gate 3, or be a CD Projekt Red and make a game of the scope of Cyberpunk 2077. Shawn Layden continues, today the entry cost for making a AAA game is in the triple-digit millions now. I think naturally risk tolerance drops. And you're looking at sequels, you're looking at copycats, because the finance guys who draw the line say, well, if Fortnite made this much money in the amount of time, my Fortnite knockoff can make this in that amount of time. We're seeing a collapse of creativity in games today with studio consolidation and the high cost of production. Because production costs have gone up, there is more of like an inclination towards making copycats of things that are highly successful, instead of trying to come up with something that can be its own form of success, that can set its own bar that others will want to chase, instead of it being the thing that's chasing something. Because it's just riskier, because things are just more expensive to make now. But I think you can just scale back, like your Fortnites and your Apex Legends and your, Rainbow Six Sieges and your PUBGs and your Destinies and all those successful live services. I mean, they kind of struck the lottery a little bit. You know what I mean? But we've seen others try to replicate that kind of success, and it takes one of those to hit for a company to have this huge source of recurrent monetization. But we've also seen more than the successes. We've seen so many live services flop and get just completely demolished by just the fact that the market has been oversaturated. They're not getting enough engagement and monetization, and we've seen a lot of them just kind of drop out. Your Marvel's Avengers and your Suicide Squads and your Babylon Falls and your Anthems. And I mean, you name it. I mean, there's so many you can point to right now that highlight that for every major success, there are like 5 or 10 that just don't really sustain themselves. These are games that demand too much money and too much time from people with limited time and limited money. That's the problem with the oversaturation of live services and these kinds of games, is the expectation that there are infinite people with infinite time and money to spend. That's just not the case. We're reaching a cap. Like, we're bursting at the seams with these live services, and people can only spend time and money on 1 or 2 of these, and there are too many of these out there right now. And all of these live services require just ridiculous budgets and ridiculous levels of financial investment to continue to run over the long term. So the amount of money they need to make to make the expenditure justifiable just isn't sustainable. And the inclination towards those kinds of long-term experiences, instead of things that are one and done like Space Marine 2 that have just a simple campaign, are just pure fun and have a beginning, middle, and end, and then you can be done with it and move on. Those kinds of experiences, the AA stuff just kind of fading away, is a bit tragic, and it just makes for a more monogamous kind of games industry where a lot of the same kinds of games are being made, instead of an industry where we can really find a lot of variety on the AAA front in particular, but also like AA was a source of so much creativity with experiences that felt high budget-ish. And that is disappearing. But fortunately, we do still have indies, and we do have some AAA developers that are still, making these really boundary-pushing and creatively driven experiences. I'm not saying those are gone, but I feel like we just, once upon a time, we saw more of that before it all became very monogamous and before publishers began to lean all towards kind of the same kinds of pursuits and this kind of gold rush. Sean Leaden had more to say about this, saying that in the gaming business, you have Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, indie stuff, but then that middle piece, that middle layer that used to be where Interplay, Gremlin, Ocean, THQ, all those companies made their money, that middle piece is gone. If you can become AAA, you survive, or if you do something interesting in the indie space, you could, but AA is gone. I think that's a threat to the ecosystem, if you will. So I'm looking at indie stuff with the advent of technologies like the latest Unreal Engine or what Unity can give you. I think we can all say that the standard of quality of video games is pretty high now compared to 10 years ago. Now, if we can just get a bit more interest and excitement and exposure for those lower budget but super creative and super unusual type of games, I'd like to see more of that, because if we're just going to rely on the blockbusters to get us through, I think that's a death sentence. And I actually really do think Sean Leaden is onto something here. I think he was one of the best bosses PlayStation ever had, and everything he says and his mindset on what gaming should be is really sensible and comes from a place of genuine love for gaming. He felt like one of those executives who was actually not just excited about the money, but was excited about the artistry of game making and the creative possibilities of game making. I miss the Sean Leaden days of PlayStation. He further adds that 1,500 developers to make the next Grand Theft Auto, that's not the place you need to go for your AA. You gotta be able to get something up and running in 2 or 3.5 years is kind of the place to be in this day and age. Most importantly, he says, don't lead with monetization. If you're going to pitch me your AA game and in the first 2 pages of your deck is your monetization and revenue subscription scheme, I'm out. Oh my God. Like, an executive who actually thinks this way is such a rare gem. It's kind of insane hearing these words or seeing these words from someone who always tends to be sort of in an executive position, who actually gives a shit about not having those kinds of pitches. Your first page has to be, this game needs to be made, and here's why. I want to see that fire. I don't want to see, here's the chief accountant on the team that's going to explain you the game's monetization. He wants to see the creative people, the creative minds, the passion shine through, and he wants an explanation for why this game will make a dent in the creative space and landscape of gaming. So it's encouraging to see that developers who are in pretty major positions in the games industry are saying these kinds of things. It's encouraging to see that we're not all leaning towards the bad habits and trends that AAA publishers tend to gravitate towards. But whether enough developers and publishers and executives think this way, I don't know. But I think the games industry, especially with the recent failures of AAA releases and live service releases, I think they're starting to see that, yeah, this is kind of all true. Once upon a time, AAA publishers used to say that the future is all live services. And now suddenly we're seeing them all recant that, backstep on that, and backtrack on that. And now we're seeing them more going back to those kinds of single-player experiences, especially as developers like Larian and CD Projekt and FromSoft highlight the massive potential success of those kinds of games that have a very enticing vision and ambition. But again, those are really high budget, and they had to build up to a point where they could take that kind of high budget risk. But something like Space Marine 2, that is, I think, the closest we've gotten recently into like AA, AAA. Maybe it's like 2.5A. Kind of a game, as the risk of making such a game because of the community that they foster diminishes as the team gains experience with these entries and they're able to kind of broaden their scope a little bit. But again, it is a gradual process, but a lot of AAA companies want to shotgun their way into being the next big billion-dollar live service, the next big billion-dollar IP, the next big AAA high-budget franchise that will just take off from the outset and just garner a huge audience base from the get-go, and they just want to rush towards what FromSoft had to labor over to get to where they are right now. Same with, again, Larian and CD Projekt and those kinds of companies who work their way up from AA to AAA, you know what I'm saying? But yeah, I don't know. It's some interesting insight from some major juggernauts in the games industry, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on all these takes and what your take is on the current state of the games industry and the AAA landscape in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.